little history of Indochina. Episode 19, King John. Last time, we focused on the military aspect of de Lattre's assignment in Indochina. And no doubt, his military report card looked good if you are a glass half full kind of person. The People's Army of Vietnam had launched 3 massive attacks on the Red River Delta, and de Lattre had won all 3 battles. But winning battles was not the only item on Dictator de Lattre's job description. He was also a high commissioner, and he had to govern the country. So that will be our focus today. Needless to say that in a country at war, it is impossible to completely isolate military issues from the politics. But hey, I will do my best. If you think of de Latre's 3 great inaugural victories, what is remarkable was that they took place at a time where de Lattre had barely put his feet under his desk, so to speak. General de Lattre confronted the French general as soon as he got off the plane. And for the first half of 1951, General de Lattre had his work cut out for him. He was fighting non-stop. But that period of fighting ended with the last major confrontation of 1951, the Battle of the Day River in May. And that Battle of the Day River is very important for 2 reasons. Firstly, after that, Lattre went back to the drawing board and gave de Lattre some space to breathe, to work, to administer, and to govern. Secondly, it was at the Battle of the Day River in May 1951 that General de Lattre lost his only son Bernard. And in retrospect, losing his son in that battle affected the general's morale and influenced the remaining month of his tenure in Indochina. First, he had to fly back to France to bury his son. And upon his return to Vietnam, he got back to work with great difficulty. His main objective was to secure the Red River Delta around Hanoi. So, he accelerated the construction of the network of fortified posts that we talked about last episode, known as La Ligne de Lattre, the de Lattre line. The aim here was to insulate the delta and make it impossible for the Viet Minh to infiltrate troops as it has been doing so far. After that, de Lattre ordered his troops to conduct quote-unquote nettoyage, or sweeps, in the countryside. The idea was to cleanse the countryside of any DRV presence and return those areas to Bao Dai's administration. After a sweep, an area was deemed quote-unquote pacified. And many of these operations were successful at face value. So a lot of Viet Minh bases were destroyed, and DRV-held areas returned to the French/Bao Dai's government fold. But these operations were not sustainable in the long run if there was no capable civil administration to control the newly pacified areas. What de Lattre wanted was for Bao Dai's government to step up and manage those areas. But poor Prime Minister Tran Van Hu had no popular backing and he had no army. So there was so much he could do. But de Lattre could not understand that. For him, these Vietnamese needed to step up and do their bit. So King John got on the phone to Prime Minister Hu and demanded the dismissal of many ministers he considered not competent enough. But de Lattre's demand was a clear interference in the internal affairs of a supposedly free and independent country. And even though Prime Minister Hu was the most pro-French politician in Vietnam, He could just not obey like an underling, and that infuriated General de Lattre. And with this interaction between Prime Minister Hu and General de Lattre, we see the first contradictions of General de Lattre's action in Indochina. On the one hand, de Lattre said everywhere that France was in Vietnam only to help the new independent Vietnam. But in reality, the High Commissioner behaved as he owned the joint. He considered everybody underlings, and he expected his orders to be executed. He ordered everybody around, Vietnamese or French, in an authoritarian and condescending style, and that didn't go well at all with Vietnamese nationalists. And these poor Vietnamese nationalists were hung out to dry out there. First, France still showed no signs of granting Vietnam anything that looked like real and genuine independence. So in those conditions, how could the Vietnamese nationalists be an alternative to Ho Chi Minh if they were treated like children by General de Lattre and by the whole French administration? And even worse for the Vietnamese nationalists, Bao Dai left them to fend for themselves. The ex-emperor spent the first half of 1951, you guessed it, on the French Riviera, very far away from the Vietnamese shitstorm. And no wonder then that the Bao Dai government lacked popular support. They were just tagging along behind France while the Viet Minh fought bloody battles against General de Lattre's forces. Anyway, de Lattre was frustrated, and his frustration was heightened by the difficulties he faced building the Vietnamese National Army. Why? Well, because the Vietnamese middle and upper class was not rushing to enroll their children in Bao Dai's army. These guys were not stupid. Seeing how things were going, many Vietnamese adopted a wait-and-see attitude and refused to enroll against the Viet Minh nor join the Viet Minh. Okay, on the one hand, they didn't like the communists, but they were not going to take a bullet for Bao Dai, who was just de Lattre's underling. And indeed, that infuriated the general, and he went so far as to blame the death of his son on Lê Hữu Tu, who was the Catholic bishop of Phat Dien. This bishop, although allied with Bao Dai, was very hostile to the High Commissioner. And de Lattre said that if the Viet Minh had attacked on the Dai River in May, and if his son had died, it was because Bishop Tu, whose fiefdom is in that area, let it happen. De Lattre continued in the summer of 1951, and he lambasted what he called les attentistes, or in English, the fence-sitters. In many speeches in the summer of 1951, he kept on saying that the Vietnamese were ungrateful towards France. I came here to help you guys, and I don't even get a thank you. We set up a Vietnamese army to fight against Ho Chi Minh, and no one is enrolling. Worse, you guys are stabbing me in the back. That line is for Bishop Tu. For example, in a speech in July 1951, during an awards ceremony at the prestigious school in Saigon, and this school was attended by privileged Vietnamese boys, de Lattre said to them, quote, "Young men of Vietnam, to whom I feel as close as I do to the youth of my native land, the moment has come for you to defend your country. Be men, meaning that if you are communist, join the Viet Minh. There are individuals there who fight well for a bad cause. But if you are patriots, fight for your homeland because this war is yours." End quote. De Lattre was so frustrated that in July 1951, he forced Bao Dai and Prime Minister Hu to decree a general mobilization and the compulsory conscription of 60,000 men. Officer schools were created, for example in De Lattre, Tuduk, and Nam Dinh, to train Vietnamese cadres. But still, the bourgeois and middle-class people were not ready to die for Bao Dai. And just one example to give you an idea of the issue. Of the 500 candidates selected to attend initial officer training in Nam Dinh and Tuduk, only 250 showed up. There were exceptions, such as General Lam Quang Thi, who is a general of the future RVN in South Vietnam in the 1670s. Well, General Thi, who was from a well-off family, entered the De Lattre school in 1951. And in his memoir, The 25-Year Century War, he said that De Lattre's speech was the catalyst for his enlistment. But he was an exception. As it happened, the peasants, not the middle class nor the rich, the peasants were the only ones whose sons ended up in the Vietnamese National Army. We talked a lot in the previous episode about Mai Elliott's family memoir, The Sacred Willow. Well, in it, Elliott recounts her father's experience after conscription was decreed. Her father was then deputy governor of Tonkin, which is northern Vietnam, and it was his responsibility to implement conscription in northern Vietnam. But it was just not happening. Wherever he went, the peasants told him bluntly, "But why would we risk our lives fighting Aussie Vietnamese in order to keep the French in power? No thanks." But the deputy governor still needed to reach his quarters. So what he did was assign a quota of recruits to each province. Each head of province had to find a way to reach their quarters. So those guys assigned quarters to their subordinates, all the way to the village chiefs at the bottom of the totem pole. And these guys' tool of recruitment was often coercion. The Vietnamese National Army's troops increased all right, going from 65,000 men in January 1951 to 120,000 in January 1952. But make no mistake, it was only because the peasants either wanted a paycheck or were forced to accept one. It was also the peasants who made up the bulk of General Giap's Popular Army of Vietnam. After failing to capture the Delta, the DRV decreed a return to the guerrilla strategy. Therefore, there was no major confrontation from June 1951 onwards. But attacks on convoys continued, as well as ambushes and targeted assassination. And the most spectacular operation was a suicide attack that killed the French commander in South Vietnam in August 1951. And this was another hard blow for General de Lattre, because the general that was killed, General Chanson, was one of his most trusted officers. Indeed, it was Chanson who got the better of Nguyen Binh in the south and improved the security situation in the Mekong Delta. And by the way, Nguyen Binh, the old VN-QDD militant who had been chosen by Ho Chi Minh in 1945 to lead the guerrilla war in the south, well, Binh was killed in an ambush in September 1951. Circumstances are murky, but it is likely that he was eliminated by General Giap, who was conducting a purge of the Vietnamese army. But in the south, the situation was more or less under control, thanks to the work of General Chanson, who was killed in the summer of 1951. However, in the north, things continued to deteriorate in the Red River Delta in the second half of 1951. Clearly, the De Lattre line, the string of hundreds of bunkers, wasn't working. Because despite the concrete posts, despite the permanent sweeps of the French mobile groups, the French could not stop the pourriture, which means the rot, as they called it. And the issue here predated de Lattre's arrival. It was just that he could not find a fix. The scenario was always the following. The French military stormed an area and expelled the Viet Minh from there. But the French, short-staffed as always, could not stay in pacified areas. And as soon as they moved on, the Viet Minh came back in, because there was still no Vietnamese civil organization capable of taking control of so-called cleansed areas for Bao Dai's government. So the poor peasants of the Delta, who just wanted to be left in peace to tend to their land, were tossed between the Viet Minh and the French. Sometimes this happened at the same time. During the day, government officials from the Bao Dai governments were in evidence, but at night, Viet Minh cadres and guerrillas would return in the village. So de Lattre was having massive issues trying to square the Vietnamese circle. Why? Because he was thinking first and foremost as a soldier. Take the Vietnamese National Army, for example. It could have been a way of making the associated state of Vietnam, of Bao Dai, more sovereign, more independent. However, for de Lattre, it was simply a solution to the lack of French troops on the ground. Since Paris was reluctant to send more soldiers, the time had come for him to, quote-unquote, and this is the French expression, to yellowize or Vietnamize the war. His idea was that the Vietnamese would man defensive positions and free the French mobile groups to go on the offensive and hunt down the Viet Minh. For him, Bao Dai's army was just a military tool, not a political one. On the other hand, though, it did not help that the Vietnamese nationalist movement was very divided. What you had, we talked about it before, was the Hoa Hao and the Cao Dai religious sects who had their own agenda. You had the Dai Viet, which was mainly a party of northerners who did not get along with the southerners, such as Prime Minister Hu or Nguyen Van Tam. General de Lattre was used to issuing orders and being obeyed, and he had neither the patience nor the interpersonal skills necessary to umpire the fighting between various Vietnamese nationalist factions. So what happened is that he did not treat Prime Minister Hu, Nguyen Van Tam, any nationalists as partners. He treated them either as subordinates who did not carry out orders properly, or worse, as ungrateful people who were too scared to fight while the elite of the French military died in Indochina. His son, for example. As Bao Dai said to de Gaulle in episode 6, quote, "We could so easily come to an understanding if you would stop pretending to be our masters." End quote. Therefore, and unsurprisingly, it was as a general that de Lattre reacted to the numerous breaches of his wall by the Viet Minh in the Red River Delta. With the de Lattre line almost completed, General de Lattre decided to recapture the military initiative and lure General Giap into the open and to force him to fight on French terms. What he did was pounce outside the Delta by capturing the town of Hoa Binh. Hoa Binh was a town in the upper region west of Hanoi. And this town was important for three reasons. One, it was easy to access from Hanoi via the Route Coloniale 6 and the Black River. Number two, Hoa Binh was sitting on a crucial supply route for the DRV. That's where the weapons from China transited on their way to the south, and that's where the rice from the south transited to go to the north. And number three, Hoa Binh was the capital of the Muong tribe. And the Muong were an ethnic minority that rallied to France out of mistrust of the Viet majority. De Lattre attacked Hoa Binh and said, quote, "I challenge General Giap to a fight," end quote. On November the 14th, 1951, French paratroopers descended on Hoa Binh and captured the city without encountering much resistance. De Lattre then cried, quote, "I have grabbed the enemy by the throat," end quote. But this was a deceptive victory because the Vietnamese units had refused battle, pulling back and waiting to fight another day on their own terms. A month later, Giap was ready, and he ordered the Division 304, 308, and 312 to converge on the Hoa Binh while launching two divisions, the 316 and 320, into the Delta to harass French rear areas. The People's Army of Vietnam did not manage to take back Hoa Binh, but what it did manage was to cut off the river and road routes leading to the city. Deadly fighting ensued because control of the road and river access was crucial if the French wanted to make it a successful operation. But the French could not retake complete control. So even though they stayed in Hoa Binh, the French found it increasingly difficult to resupply the town and their troops because the road and river access were taken. And at the same time, the security situation in the Delta continued to go south. In February 1952, General Salon had no other choice than to order the evacuation of the 20,000 soldiers in Hoa Binh in order to focus on defending the Red River Delta. And this withdrawal from Hoa Binh was incredibly difficult. French troops had to fight their way out through enemy lines and ambushes, and the survivors dubbed it l'enfer de Hoa Binh, meaning the hell of Hoa Binh. The Viet Minh government immediately reoccupied the town and built back its logistics network in the area. And this was the beginning of what would later, during the American War, become the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And you would have noticed that the decision to evacuate Hoa Binh was taken by a General Salon. Yes, I said Salon and not De Lattre, because De Lattre did not live to see the retreat from Hoa Binh. On November the 19th, he had left Vietnam for so-called high-level meetings in Paris. In reality, De Lattre was terminally ill with cancer, and he died in Paris on January the 11th, 1952, without knowing if General Giap had accepted his challenge. And that's how the De Lattre year, l'année de Lattre, ended. And the question is how to describe these full-on 12 months of this general in Indochina. In his HQ in the upper region of northern Vietnam, General Vo Nguyen Giap must have smiled when he learned of De Lattre's death. He got better of the fifth general after Leclerc, Valui, Blaiseau, and Carpentier. So let's review De Lattre's year, though, without Giap's lens. To his credit, General De Lattre single-handedly had righted the French ship after the Chinese border debacle, and had prevented Ho Chi Minh from celebrating Lunar New Year 1951 in Hanoi. Secondly, De Lattre can be credited also for starting to build a Vietnamese national army. De Lattre has also tried to mobilize the population to actively support the war against the DRV. On the other hand, one cannot help but notice that despite his military prowess, when he left, the military situation on the ground was exactly the same as when he arrived. So De Latre's strategy ultimately failed to turn the tide of the war. On the political side of things, De Lattre was an authoritarian. He had dictatorial dictatorial manners, and his methods alienated many Vietnamese whose aspirations for independence were never taken seriously by the High Commission. And de Lattre was no different from High Commissioners before him. His objective was to keep Indochina in the French Union, and that was it. And that objective also led him to go above and beyond to convince the Americans to become more involved in the war. And here his legacy was extremely important. He had managed to convince the Americans that Vietnam and Korea were two fronts of the same war. As a result, when he died in 1952, the Americans were already paying 50% of the French bill. But this aid opened the door to American economic and political influence. And this influence would be increasingly difficult to contain for the French. And it is not an exaggeration to say that the death of General Jean de Lattre Tassigny was a traumatic experience for France. The general was promoted marshal posthumously, but the question on all the lips in Paris was now, if de Lattre had not succeeded in Indochina, who could succeed? The French political class wanted to keep French Indochina in the Republic. But they could not say so openly because they did not have the means to achieve that ambition. And that was why they had came up with the Associated States scheme, pretending to give Vietnam independence, but working in actual fact to stay. The scheme appealed to the US, but it completely discredited non-communist Vietnamese nationalists. So therefore, what did success look like in Vietnam for France? That was the question. And the only person back then who dared to express things clearly and confront reality was a guy called Pierre Mendès France. And I will end this episode with a quote from a speech he gave in the parliament in 1950. And this is what Pierre Mendès France had to say. Quote, "We have to choose between two solutions that are equally difficult, but which are the only ones that can really be defended from this podium. The first is to achieve our objectives in Indochina by means of military force. If we choose it, we must obtain decisive military successes quickly, and for that, we need 3 times as many troops and 3 times the money we spend over there. The other solution is to seek a political agreement, an agreement obviously with those who are fighting us." End quote. And we will end it here today. Thank you for listening, and until next time, bye.